My name is Margaret Ellis, and for 31 years, I kept a secret so heavy it should have broken my spine. Not because I was ashamed of it, because I was afraid of what would happen if I ever said it out loud in that house. I smiled at family dinners while my sister took credit for sacrifices that weren't hers. I stayed quiet while my own mother called me the difficult one in front of relatives who had no idea what really happened behind the closed door of my father's bedroom in his final years. I said nothing when his will was read, and my name was barely mentioned. I told myself the truth would surface on its own someday. What I didn't know was that the truth wouldn't just surface. It would come back, and it would bring something with it that none of us were prepared for, because some things that happen in a dying man's house don't stay buried just because the family agrees not to talk about them. Before I tell you what happened at my mother's 85th birthday dinner, the night my 6-year-old granddaughter asked one small question that cracked our family open. I need you to understand something about the house where I spent 4 years of my life. Because the house was never empty, even when I was the only living person inside it. I grew up the middle child in a family of 5 outside Dayton, Ohio. My sister Diane was the golden one, loud and magnetic. My brother Peter was the baby, dotted on endlessly. I was the quiet one, the one who did what was asked without complaint. So when my father's heart began failing in his 60s and the doctors said he needed round-the-clock care, it was simply assumed, without discussion, that I would be the one to give up my life for his. I left my job. I moved into the house I'd grown up in, and for 4 years, it was just the two of us. In that old house at the edge of the woods, with its long hallway upstairs and the room at the end of it that my father asked me, more than once, never to go into after dark. I thought, at first, it was simply an old man's superstition. He'd always been strange about that room. It had been my grandmother's sewing room, then a storage space, and by the time I moved back in, it was locked. The key kept in a drawer in his nightstand that he checked every night before sleep. The way some people check that a stove is off. I didn't ask questions at first. You don't, when someone is dying and set in their ways. But as the months turned into years, and his condition worsened, I began to notice things I couldn't explain. Small things, I told myself, had rational answers. The sound of the floorboards creaking upstairs when I knew I was the only one awake in the house. The way the temperature in the hallway outside that locked room dropped sharply, enough that I could see my breath. In July, the nights my father would wake gasping, not from his heart, but from a dream he refused to describe, saying only, gripping my hand hard enough to bruise, "Don't let them tell you the room was empty." It was never empty. If you've ever cared for someone in the final years of their life, you know that grief and exhaustion can make you doubt your own senses. I told myself that's all it was. I told myself the creak in the floorboards was the house settling, the cold in the hallway was a draft, and my father's fear was simply the confusion that comes near the end. I want to be honest with you now. No way, I wasn't honest with myself back then. Because before this story is over, you'll understand exactly why I needed to believe those lies, and exactly what happened the one night I stopped believing them. If any part of this feels familiar to you, if you've ever felt something in a house that no one else would acknowledge, go ahead and hit subscribe now. Because what happened in that room didn't stay in the past. It followed my family for years, quietly, waiting the same way I was waiting, and it finally caught up with all of us at a dinner table 4 years ago. During those 4 years, Diane visited twice. Peter visited 3 times, always leaving before dark, which I found strange until much later, when I learned he'd grown up hearing the same warnings about that room that I had, and had simply chosen, as an adult, to never test them. My mother, who lived 20 minutes away, called often, but rarely came in person. And on the 2 occasions she did visit, she refused to stay past sunset, offering no explanation beyond a tight smile and the words, "Your father knows why." There were other small things too, things I filed away without examining too closely because examining them felt dangerous, felt like it would make them real in a way I wasn't ready for. A music box that had belonged to my grandmother, kept on a shelf in the hallway outside that locked room, would sometimes play on its own in the dead of night. a thin, tinny melody drifting through the walls, always stopping the instant I opened my bedroom door to investigate. My father's dog, a gentle old collie named Buster, who had never shown fear of anything in his life, refused entirely to walk past that door, choosing instead to take the long way around through the kitchen and dining room whenever he needed to reach the other end of the house. And there were the dreams, the same dream, recurring so often in my father's final years that he eventually stopped mentioning it, of a young woman standing at the foot of his bed. Not threatening, he insisted, just watching, just waiting, her hands folded in front of her, the way you'd wait for someone to finally notice you'd been wronged. I didn't understand what she meant until the night everything changed. 8 months before my father passed. It was late October, past midnight, and I'd fallen asleep in the chair beside his bed, the way I often did during his bad weeks. I woke to the sound of the sewing room door, the locked door at the end of the hall standing open, and my father's nightstand drawer pulled out, the key missing. My father was asleep, or seemed to be, his breathing shallow but steady, and for a moment I told myself I'd imagined the sound that had woken me. Then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from inside that room, moving toward the open door. I want you to understand that I am not a fanciful person. I have never believed in ghost stories, never watched horror movies without rolling my eyes at the jump scares. But I stood in that hallway at 1 in the morning, and I watched the door of that room swing open the rest of the way on its own, revealing a space that should have been empty, dust-covered, full of old boxes, and instead was lit faintly, impossibly, by a light with no visible source, illuminating a single object I hadn't seen in that room before, an old photograph, propped upright against the far wall, of a young woman I didn't recognize, standing in front of that very house. Decades before I was born. Didn't go in. I want to be honest. I was too afraid to cross that threshold that night. I closed the door, and in the morning, when I asked my father about it, expecting him to dismiss it as a dream, he instead went very pale, and told me a story he had never told anyone else in the family, not even my mother, not fully, before he bought the house. Back in the 1950s, it had belonged to a family named Whitcomb. The eldest daughter, a young woman named Rachel Whitcomb, had died in that upstairs room, under circumstances the town had never fully explained. Some said illness, some said something far worse, involving her own family and an inheritance dispute that had turned violent. My father, when he bought the house decades later, young and skeptical, hadn't believed the stories the neighbors told him, until things started happening. Small things, at first, easy to dismiss. Then, over the years, things that were harder to explain: cold spots, sounds, the sense of being watched in that particular hallway, always tied to that one room, as if whatever remained of Rachel Whitcomb had never left, had simply been waiting patiently, the way I would come to wait for the truth about my own family. So many years later, father told me he'd learned, through trial and a kind of grim intuition, that the presence in that room seemed to respond to one thing above all else: dishonesty within the family living in the house. He believed, and I watched him say it with the flat certainty of a man who had lived alongside it for decades, that whatever remained of Rachel Whitcomb had died because of a lie her own family told about an inheritance, a lie that erased her from a story she deserved credit in. And that something about that injustice had tethered her to the house, restless, listening always for the same betrayal to repeat itself under his roof. He told me more that morning than he ever repeated again, as though saying it once had cost him something, and he didn't have the strength to pay that price twice. Rachel Whitcomb, he said, had been the eldest of 4 children, the one who had nursed her own dying father through his final illness while her siblings built their lives elsewhere, much the way I would one day nurse him. When the old man passed, his will had favored a younger sibling, a brother who had visited rarely and contributed nothing, and the family had closed ranks around that decision, telling anyone who asked that Rachel had simply been the difficult one, too demanding, too resentful, worthy of the trust her father's estate represented. Rachel died in that upstairs room less than a year later, officially of a fever, though the neighbors who remembered the family always lowered their voices when they mentioned it. as though the word fever was a kindness extended to a story that deserved a harder truth. "Don't let them lie about you the way they lied about her," he told me that morning, gripping my hand the way he had during his worst nights. "The house remembers. It always remembers who really did the work, and who only claimed they did." I didn't fully understand what he meant until years later, at that birthday dinner, when the truth about my own sacrifice finally came out. And something about that revelation, something I still can't fully explain, seemed to answer a debt that had been open in that house since long before I was born. My father passed away that following spring. In that room, on a Tuesday morning, my hand in his. In his final week, he made me promise something strange, something I agreed to without fully understanding. Simply because you agree to almost anything a dying man asks. He made me promise that no matter what happened with the will, no matter who claimed credit for his final years, I would eventually tell the truth out loud. In that house, at that table, where the family gathered, he said it had to be spoken aloud, inside those walls, or the debt would never close. I thought, in my grief, that he was simply confused, medicated, not entirely himself. I didn't think much more about it until the will was read 3 weeks later, and Diane, who had visited twice and for years, was left the house entirely, in recognition of her devotion during his final years. I sat in that reading and said nothing. The same silence I'd practiced my whole life. And I told myself the strange conversation about Rachel Whitcomb and the sewing room had simply been the confusion of a dying mind. Diane moved in 2 months later. She renovated the house top to bottom, and when I heard, through a cousin, that she'd finally opened the old sewing room, knocked through the wall to expand the upstairs bathroom, hauling out decades of boxes she called junk, I felt a strange, cold unease I couldn't name, and told myself it was simply grief. Over the following years, Diane became the family's golden narrative keeper, hosting every holiday in that renovated house, telling anyone who'd listen how devoted she'd been to our father, how close they'd been, while my mother reinforced the story constantly. I remarried, built a quiet life with my husband Robert, and eventually became a grandmother to my son's daughter, Lily, a bright, watchful little girl, with my father's pale gray eyes, who had, from a very young age, an unsettling habit of noticing things adults preferred to ignore. Lily had never been inside my father's old house, Diane's house now, more than a handful of times. Always for short visits, always. I noticed only in hindsight, during daylight hours, with Diane subtly steering the children away from the upstairs hallway without ever quite explaining why. 4 years ago, at my mother's 85th birthday dinner, we all gathered at that house. At the long table Diane had bought to replace the one my father built with his own hands. 20 of us, the good china out, my mother at the head of the table, like a queen surveying her court, telling the story again of Diane's devotion. The story I had swallowed silently for 3 decades. The lights flickered twice during dinner. No one but me seemed to notice, or if they noticed, no one but me seemed to feel the cold that came with it, settling over the table the way it used to settle in that upstairs hallway on the worst nights of my father's illness. I remember looking toward the staircase, toward the hallway I hadn't walked down since the day of his funeral, and feeling, for the first time in years, that unmistakable sense of being watched, patiently, by something that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finally tell the truth inside those walls. And then, into a silence that fell strangely over the table, a silence to complete for a room full of 20 people, as though something had reached in and pulled the noise out of the air. My granddaughter Lily looked up from her plate and asked, in the clear, unguarded voice of a 6-year-old who has no idea what she's about to unravel, "Grandma Diane, if you lived with great-grandpa when he was sick, how come Grandma Margaret has all his medicine bottles in her memory box? And why does the upstairs hallway feel like great-grandpa's room? Did all cold like that?" The table went silent in a way I had never experienced. Diane's face drained of color, and not, I would realize later, only from embarrassment. She glanced, involuntarily, toward the staircase, the same way I had moments before, and for just a second, I saw something in her expression I recognized instantly. Because I had lived with it myself for 4 years, Fear of that hallway. Fear she had never once admitted to anyone. Fear she'd been managing quietly by simply keeping the family away from it during gatherings. My mother's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. The overhead light flickered again, longer this time, and somewhere upstairs, faint but unmistakable in the sudden hush, floorboards creaked, slow and deliberate. The exact rhythm I remembered from the nights I'd sat beside my father's bed. I could have stayed silent again. That was still, in that moment, the more familiar choice. But I remembered my father's hand gripping mine, his voice telling me the debt had to be spoken aloud inside those walls. And something in me, 31 years in the making, finally refused to let the moment close back over itself. I set down my fork, looked at my mother, and then at Diane, and said, calmly, without raising my voice, into a room that had gone unnaturally still, "It's not complicated, Lily. I lived with great-grandpa for years while he was sick, in this house, in that room upstairs. I gave up my job to do it. Grandma Diane visited twice in those 4 years. That's the truth. It's just something the grown-ups don't like to say out loud in this house." The moment I finished speaking, the lights in the dining room steadied. The cold that had settled over the table lifted, all at once, like a held breath, finally released, and the creaking upstairs stopped entirely. I didn't imagine the way every adult in that room felt it too. The way Peter's wife shivered and pulled her cardigan tighter. The way my mother's eyes went wide and fixed on the staircase, before darting back to her plate, unwilling to acknowledge what she'd just felt. Diane, cornered and pale, tried to laugh it off, tried to reframe things the way she always had. But her voice shook in a way I had never heard from her before, and I understood then that she had spent every gathering in that house since our father's death quietly managing a fear she'd never named. A fear of the hallway, of the cold spot outside what used to be the sewing room, of the sense that something in that house was keeping score the same way our father always said it would. Peter, to my genuine surprise, was the one who broke the tension, looking between Diane and me, something shifting behind his eyes as 30 years of family narrative rearranged itself in real time. "Wait," he said quietly, "is that true? You actually lived there the whole time?" And he hesitated, glancing at the staircase himself. "Is that why Dad always said not to go upstairs after dark?" I told them, then calmly, what our father had told me the morning after that first frightening night. The story of Rachel Whitcomb, the inheritance dispute that erased her from her own family story, and the way our father believed the house had never forgotten that particular injustice. I told them about his promise, the one he'd extracted from me on his deathbed, that I would speak the truth aloud in that house someday, at that table, or the debt would never close. My mother didn't apologize that night. Not fully. Not in the way I'd once imagined she might. Some things don't unravel in a single dinner. But something in that house had changed, unmistakably, and everyone at that table felt it, whether they were willing to say so aloud or not. In the months that followed, Diane quietly hired a contractor to finish knocking through what remained of the old sewing room walls entirely, transforming the space into an open reading nook flooded with sunlight. And she told me once, in a rare unguarded moment, that the hallway outside it finally, for the first time since she'd moved in, felt like an ordinary hallway. Peter began calling me more, asking real questions about those for years, listening in a way he never had before. And my mother, slowly, without ever quite admitting she'd been wrong, stopped calling me the difficult one, at least not to my face, and stopped telling the story of Diane's devotion at every holiday. I still think, sometimes, about my father's words that morning, after the photograph appeared in that locked room, that the house remembered who really did the work, and who only claimed they did. I don't know exactly what lived in that hallway for all those years, or whether it was Rachel Whitcomb's restless grief over her own erased sacrifice, recognizing something of itself in mine. I only know that the night I finally spoke the truth aloud at that table, something in that house exhaled, and it never troubled my family again. Here's what I've learned, and what I hope you carry with you. If any part of this story felt familiar, silence has a cost. Even when we tell ourselves we're being patient, even when we tell ourselves the truth will surface on its own. Some houses, some families, keep the weight of an unspoken truth in their walls for decades. Waiting. The same way I waited. The same way Rachel Whitcomb apparently waited. For someone brave enough, or simply tired enough, to finally say it out loud. If you have been the one who sacrifices quietly while someone else takes the credit, I want you to know that your silence was never weakness. It was patience. And patience, when it finally meets its moment, has a way of shaking loose everything that needed to be seen, and heard, and felt, all along. If this story gave you chills, tell me in the comments whether you've ever felt something in a house that no one else would acknowledge. Some presence, some cold spot, some unexplained sound that only made sense once the truth finally came out. And if you know someone who has spent years being the one who gives without recognition, share this with them. Because sometimes the most healing thing you can offer someone is the reminder that their truth matters, and that some part of the universe, whether it's karma or something older and stranger, is always quietly keeping score. Thank you for listening. This has been another story from LegacyWhisper, and I'll see you in the next one.